Okay, so it's being recorded now. Great. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for our colloquium with Dr. Mark Brandt. Before we start this, which is our first in-person colloquium in a very long time, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. And we thank the Musqueam Nation for its hospitality and support of our work. And I'd also like to acknowledge that in the BC Lower Mainland, we also live and work on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and other Coast Salish peoples. And many people are joining today on Zoom from many other places, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Mark Brandt. Mark's an assistant professor at Michigan State University, where he's been since 2020. So he moved here during the pandemic. Mark is a true Midwesterner. He growing up in Michigan, and he then did all of his post-secondary education in Chicago, getting his BA from Concordia University, and then his PhD at DePaul University in 2012. And then right from graduating, he went straight to his first academic appointment, which was at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And this was kind of interesting timing because the Tilburg psychology department had just been through a big crisis, as it had been the home of Diederik Stapel, who shortly before Mark joined was revealed to have been the biggest fraud in the history of psychology. And so following this, Tilburg established itself, though, as the new center for championing open science, transparency, and scientific rigor. And this is something that's clearly shaped Mark's own career. He's been involved in several large-scale replication efforts and has a strong commitment to best practices in his own research. And he's co-creator of the Collaborative Replication and Education Project. Mark is interested in people's political, religious, and moral beliefs. And in particular, he's interested in how these beliefs divide people. And he finds that a common tendency across the ideological spectrum is for people to show much animosity towards those with differing worldviews. And interestingly, he demonstrates that this outgroup animosity is comparable in strength across the whole spectrum for liberals and conservatives alike. He's also been interested in exploring the structure of people's political beliefs and has created some new methods to capture people's individualized belief systems. He uses a broad array of very clever methods in his research, borrowing methods from other fields and applying them to new questions. And Mark has had a stellar career already. It's only been 10 years since he got his PhD, but he's already won several awards, including the APS Rising Star Award, the Sage Young Scholar Award, and the SPSB Wegner Theoretical Innovation Prize. And I'm told he has the world's most comprehensive knowledge of underground, punk, and hardcore. Okay, but please join me in welcoming Mark Brandt. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming, both in person and on Zoom. I always feel like I really appreciate these introductions. They're make me feel really uncomfortable and set expectations way too high. And so I'm glad to be the first of your kind of back to in-person colloquium. The handheld mic is on. The lapel mic is on.
Let's try speaking with your mic off. Your computer is still not in there. Okay, let's try now.
All right. So let's see how this works.
Okay, we're
good. Woo. Yeah. So that just to start you guys off low, so you can have everybody much improved in your future colloquiums. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that has nothing to do with anything that Steve talked about in my introduction. And this is work I've been doing looking at COVID-19 and the onset of that and people's political attitudes. A lot of people, when at least it felt like this, a lot of people when COVID hit, there was a lot of kind of COVID projects, and I studiously avoided this for as long as possible. And so that's why I'm now doing this many years later. All right. Let's see if I can. Oops. Well, all right. I was hoping the thing at the top would go away, but I never quite figure out how that works. 3 dots. I mean, it's not a big deal. I don't think anything will be up there most of the time. So my research in general looks at political attitudes, a lot of different kinds of them. I'm just interested in how they work. And so to kind of want to put this current project a little bit into the space that I work in. So I often look at political attitudes. I look at them as a cause. So looking at how they might cause people's feelings of animosity towards the people that they disagree with. Work I've been doing recently has been trying to look at their structure, trying to figure out how they're related to one another and how this might vary across people and what are possible consequences of that. And today what I'll be talking to you about is trying to look at them as consequences. What causes these different political attitudes and how do they come apart? So the question, the kind of key core question that I'm looking at today is, did the onset of the pandemic change people's attitudes? Just I think a kind of straightforward question in a sense. And just there's this big societal event impacted not just the country I was living in and the country that I then moved to, not just the country you're all living in, it affected everywhere, right? It's a big deal. And so did this change people's political attitudes? And I think this is interesting for a few reasons. One kind of like theoretical side thing that I think is kind of interesting that I won't talk about, so I'll just put it in your heads now, is like we run these lab studies where we bring people into the lab and then we try to change their attitudes. This seems like a bigger event than most lab studies. So I think that's useful context to put that in. My talk today is going to be all about this stuff in the US because that's where I have data from. If you have Canadian data that would work for this, would love it. So happy to extend this. The kind of theoretical reason that I find this interesting is that COVID is one type of threat, or actually it's kind of a bundle of threats. It's a health threat, it's an economic threat, maybe a threat to other kind of functioning of the society. And there's this long line of work in political psychology and social psychology that looks at how threat affects people's political attitudes. And people are interested in trying to figure out, so how does the fear of war or terrorism or crime change or affect people's attitudes? Does it make them more or less conservative? Does it push them to have more stringent attitudes about fighting terrorism, for example, after terrorist attacks? And the other thing that we kind of look at with this study is whether or not everybody's responding the same way, or is this variability? Recently, just kind of in general, I've been kind of interested in this idea that actually many of the times when we're studying things, we're studying on like average effects, which are great. But at the same time, we're all different and unique in our own ways. And so where is this variability? What can we describe it? Can we estimate it? And what are the consequences of that? Oops, I forgot I had this animation. There you go. See, everybody has a different effect. That's the point. Okay, so how might attitudes change from COVID? Now, there's different ways that one can approach this. So, I've presented this to political scientists, and then they have a variety of other theories that they draw on instead, which is fine. They can do that. But as a political psychologist, at least, I'm looking at the psychology of threat. This is often what we would focus on in this kind of situation. The typical idea in political psychology is that threat is a cause of people's political attitudes because the political attitudes in some way help people address the threat. The typical study will measure or manipulate the salience of a threat and look at how it affects one or maybe a couple of different political attitudes. So what we're going to do here is we're also going to focus on one threat, but rather than trying to do this, measure this or manipulate this in the lab or on a survey, we're going to just look at this real world instantiation of this threat. And we're going to look at this across a bunch of different attitudes, I think 84 in total. So what kind of patterns might we expect? I'm going to look at 3 here. There might be others that are out there, but I think these 3 kind of make sense from the prior literature on this topic. So one is the conservative shift, a cultural conservative shift, and then what I'm calling an issue ownership shift, which is an annoying name that I don't have a better one for. So the conservative shift is basically, I should also say, I'm going to give you like the 60-second version of each of these. So there's more to them, of course, but I'll give you the brief version. So here's the idea behind the conservative shift. People, when they experience threat, this creates a sense of uncertainty, and people don't like this. It's annoying. So then how do you deal with that uncertainty? You turn towards political attitudes, or one way you can do this, you turn towards political attitudes that help reduce that uncertainty. And the idea is, from this perspective, is that conservative political attitudes in general should be particularly good at this because there is this sense of resistance to change and support for established hierarchies within conservatism, and this helps reduce uncertainty. You're kind of turning towards our established traditions and established hierarchies to reduce that uncertainty. So from this perspective, when the pandemic hits, the onset of the pandemic ought to shift people in a conservative direction across a broad range of issues, potentially all issues. Don't think anybody's really specified the breadth here, but across a broad range of issues. The cultural conservative shift, which is developed a lot from research at UBC, is kind of a similar idea. The idea is different, I should say, but the outcome is similar, but applied primarily to culturally conservative attitudes. Culturally conservative attitudes, sometimes called socially conservative attitudes, tend to be attitudes related to supporting traditional values in terms of, often in terms of gender and sexuality, but also sometimes immigration is thrown in here as well, and traditional religious values as well. The idea here is that when people experience threat, in particular pathogen threats, of which COVID is one, people desire to protect the norms and rituals that help them avoid pathogens. There's a variety of these. And this sort of desire to protect these norms, this kind of caution conformity sort of spills over into other attitudes. And when we talk about this in the political realm, this tends to be the culturally conservative political attitudes. And so from this perspective, you'd expect a shift in conservative direction on culturally conservative issues, particularly around gender and sexuality, but also potentially immigration and so on. Okay, the last one is the issue ownership shift. This is probably the most complicated of the bunch. The idea here is that when people feel threatened, they then look around and they're like, what helps me solve this threat? What might that be? And the idea here is that there's no kind of one ideology that solves all possible threats, or at least is not perceived to solve all possible threats. And so in the political science literature, there's this idea of issue ownership, which is just the idea that some ideological parties, ideological like leanings and political parties are kind of seen as best suited to address particular issues. So around the world, for example, left-leaning parties tend to be seen as more equipped at addressing unemployment than our right-leaning parties. People just kind of agree on this in general. There's some consensus this. So then, depending on the threat, they're going to turn towards different political attitudes, and we'll turn to whether conservative or liberal political attitudes, depending on whether these attitudes are seen as helping to solve the threat. So then we have to ask ourselves, what are the threats involved in COVID-19? So one is that it's, at least in the US, this was seen as kind of a threat or something coming from the outside. There was a lot of concern and about people from China and Asia more broadly, and a lot of kind of ugly rhetoric around that. So if this is the case, then we might expect conservative shift on issues related to outsiders, in particular, more kind of anti-immigration policies, I think is one kind of straightforward issue, but also you could see this as more kind of issues related to security of the kind of country and the group in general. So support for defense spending and these sorts of things would be kind of a broader version of this. At the same time, we should expect to see liberal shift on issues related to social welfare and health. So COVID was also this economic threat. People lost their jobs, were sent home from their jobs. Things really changed in this way. And so policies aiming to help unemployment, which tend to be on the liberal side, should be supported here. And also liberals tend to be seen as more adept at handling healthcare. This is also something that's consistent across countries. And so we might expect them to liberal shift on healthcare. Liberal and left-wing healthcare policies tend to be one that distribute the load, right? And this is quite useful when you don't know what's happening with the pandemic. And then I'm just going to throw in some like support for some intuition for the null here. The study of attitude stability finds that political attitudes are super stable. So there's actually there's a nice article in The Economist, I think the last week or two, where they highlight that cultural change happens because people die. It's not because people change their mind, which is fun to think about, let's say. So there is some, so we're going to look at these three hypotheses in this data, but I'm going to build you up a little bit more here. So there's some existing work on how COVID might have changed people's political attitudes, but there's some shortcomings here that I think we solve, and I just want to highlight how we solve them because I think it's shows the kind of interesting things we can do with our work here. So one is that there's just a long time between the observations in these prior studies. So for example, in one study, wave one happened in essentially spring to summer 2019, and the second wave happened after the start of COVID. And so in between here, sure, there was COVID, but also The Mandalorian was released on Disney Plus, and Trump was impeached. So like some pretty big, important things, right? Baby Yoda joined us. So don't tell you, that's been a big impact on my political beliefs. I don't know about you. The point here is like, this is interesting data that they have, just to be clear, but it's just the inference is messy. Other people, I think what happened, and I think this is totally understandable, is that COVID happened and then they're like, man, we got to figure out what's going on. And then they put studies in the field. But then the studies that they're looking at attitude change actually start after the onset of COVID. And so then we don't know. Well, it's interesting to see how things change after the onset of COVID. We can't attribute that change to COVID already exists in the study. And then the other, there's this Bisbee and Honig paper is a really nice paper. So I really pump up this paper. But what they only have vote choice for specific candidates. That's the only thing they have. And so then if you're going to look at this culturally conservative shift hypothesis, or looking for a liberal shift on unemployment issues and social welfare policies, you just can't do it. It doesn't have quite the measures. So in our work, we have tons of different measures, and we have fine-grained repeated measure designs, and there's two variations on that theme. But basically what happens is that we have a first wave, we have a last wave, and we have lots of other waves in between. And so we have close to day-to-day changes, estimates of changes in people's attitudes. I think it's really cool. So we have two studies here. One is the Nationscape data, which is not collected by us. It's by this voter study group. They collected weekly repeated cross-sections of data of Americans. So every week is a new sample of people, and it's new people every time. So it's always different people. And they did this, well, the data we use was between July 2019 and end of May 2020. Our specific cutoff date there is that's when George Floyd was murdered in the US, which set off the Black Lives Matter protests. There's other evidence suggesting that changed people's attitudes on some things. And so we just left that off. So we don't have to, well, for inference reasons, we don't have to worry about that. They also have data that continues on well after this. This study went on for quite some time. It's a really nice data source if you're interested in political topics. They have 67 issue items, wide range of political issues. And then they have 4 items that are kind of people's feelings of threat towards the different things. These are not perfect measures, but they give us a sense in whether people felt threatened by the pandemic. Study 2, this was collected by my lab. Substantially smaller sample size, but that's because we have the same people every damn time, every 2 weeks for a year. This was collected on prolific, so it's not representative or anything like that, but we did try to get our original sample to be proportioned to vote choice in the 2016 election. And we started collecting data in May of 2019, and we ended at the end of April 2020. We have 17 issue items and 4 threat items. So a downside here is of both these studies is we did not choose the items thinking that COVID would happen, right? And if we did that, that would be unethical because it means that we had foresight that COVID was going to happen, and we should have done a little bit more warning than we did, right? So it was a surprise to all of us, but we have items that we can draw on that I think help us answer these questions. I want to this is all the issues, no, sorry, this is not all the issues from study 1, but I want to just kind of highlight a few things here, is that when we talk about cultural issues, we have a bunch of items pertaining to abortion of various ways. So late-term abortion or never permitting abortion, or whether abortion can be covered in insurance plans. We also have items about like just the role of women in society, such as I would be more comfortable having a man as a boss than a woman, and these sorts of things. So there's a range of issues within each cluster here. Some cultural issues are also these kind of security, protect from outsider issues, and these are mostly immigration issues. A lot of different items related to immigration. Security issues tend to be about guns and war type things. We only have, unfortunately, we have relatively few social welfare policies. Those are the only two in this data set, but they're about guaranteeing jobs or more government services. And then healthcare is just a variety of different policies from more or less extreme within the American context. Although healthcare policy in the American context is always just not actually very extreme in the liberal direction. That's a different story. Study 2, we have different issues and we have fewer of them. But many of the same kind of ideas show up across all of these different issues. I'm going to leave this here while I get a drink of water.
The vaccination nomination, you didn't have that for a second.
It's about childhood vaccines. So that's an item where some of these items, it's like that one, I bet has a slightly different meaning now than it did when we put it on. And when we put it on, we had a conversation of like, what's an attitude or an issue that's important, but there's not big partisan divides on. Which is true at the time, but yeah, it's kind of, yeah, sad, funny in retrospect. So funny, I don't know if sad, funny, that's a good, it's an emotion. Germans have a word. But. So our first question then is, does the onset of COVID change political attitudes? And kind of also then we're just going to compare this to predictions from these threat theories. So our analytic strategy, I want to walk through this a little bit more carefully than I do in many talks, in part because I'm going to kind of make a causal claim here from this data, although it's not an experimental data, and I just want to walk through why I think we can do that, at least to some degree. We have what's called the interrupted time series design, is basically we look to see if we have a marker in our data for this event, and we're like, does this things differ before the before and after the event? There's these two trends in our data are capturing whether the trend before the onset of the pandemic and then after it. These are just kind of removing those influences. Well, you can see these in many of the figures. But our key one here is this change estimate. It's just basically a binary variable saying whether our observation is before or after the onset of the pandemic. And this is the estimate that you'll see across many, many different figures from here on out. We're trying to estimate how big that change is for the pandemic. We use multi-level models in the Nationscape data. So this is different people in each survey, but we nest them in weeks because that's a different survey, which they have many of the same items, but there are some differences, and then also nest them in days. And the study 2, which is this, sorry, I use my old abbreviations here, but that's nested in persons. This is our longitudinal study. And so that means our change estimate is kind of the estimated change for, like a within person estimate. And then we do this just a ton of times. Now, to do this, we need to make a few assumptions to make a causal effect. So random assignment would get us would take care of a lot of these for us, but we don't have that. So one assumption is that similar people completed it pre and post onset of the pandemic. So we did test this. We looked at some demographic differences before and after the pandemic. We do find some small ones, but when we control for this, this does not change our inferences. There's some minor differences in like the precise size of the estimate, but the overall conclusions are the same for basically everything that we did. Another assumption is that there's no methodological changes that affect the estimates. So you can imagine that if we were fielding these in person, COVID hits, then we field it online. There's other evidence that suggests that people are a little bit more extreme in their political opinions online. That would kind of mess us up here. Well, we were already doing it all online. And so the procedure the procedure was the same across all of this, which is nice. Another assumption is that this is a bit more complicated, but the idea is that when we say that people are pre-onset of the pandemic, that they did not experience the pandemic. and that people post-onset have experienced the pandemic. The reason this is a little complicated is that what counts as the onset of the pandemic, right? So if you count when was the first cases in Wuhan, well, that's in December, essentially, of 2019. We had at the department I was in at the time, one of our PhD students had family in Wuhan, and she was much worried about this way before the rest of us, because her family was dealing with it very directly. And then there's a weird time where it was happening and nobody cared, or it felt like nobody cared, right? And then all of a sudden people cared, right? So how do we deal with that? So one thing that we did here is that we looked at just Google search volume for topics related to COVID. And we kind of lined this up with some important dates within the US COVID story. So the US confirmed that the CDC confirmed the first US case at the end of January, the green dash line. And Trump declared a national emergency about COVID in early March, which is that orange dash line. And you can see that the search volume for this kind of went from nothing from that green line to being really at its peak after this national emergency. And so we assume that everything before that green line is pre-onset, everything after that, the orange line is post-onset, and everything in between we just don't include in the analysis. It'll show up on some figures, but that's just so you can see it, and then you can kind of make your own decision about it. But the other stuff is just wiped out. There's other evidence that backs this up. So if you look at the CDC press releases, they have exactly one press release about COVID before we say that's pre-onset, and it happened 2 days before our onset date. The CDC just did not care about COVID, it turns out. It's a little sad. Other people have looked at Twitter data, and they show similar spikes in interest as this Google data. And then other people have looked at mobility data with smartphones, which is really kind of an interesting thing in general, I think. But they find that after our onset date, that's actually when you see these huge drops in mobility as everybody started staying home. So we think this is sensible cutoffs. All right, so first I'm going to look at the threat measures, because the whole premise of these ideas is that people feel threat and then they change their attitudes. And so if people didn't feel any threat from COVID, then we could be like, okay, we're done. We shouldn't expect anything to happen, right? So first we look if there's threat. So in study one, we have 4 measures of threat: whether they see the economy as worse, whether they see the country is on the wrong track, whether they see Americans as losing commonalities, or whether they think Christianity is under assault. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that these are all expected to move around, but they're all threats that are included in this data. So I show you all. I think what's key here is that, I have this. So the line, the dark black line on the left, that's the trend pre-COVID. The one on the right is the trend post-COVID. Each little dot is the sample mean on that day. And this change estimate here is the change due to COVID. And so what we see is that people really did see the economy as much worse following the onset of COVID, which makes some sense. This is tracking reality to some degree. They also saw the country as more on the wrong track following COVID. Did not seem to change much about how they saw commonalities in Americans or whether Christianity was under assault. And the second study, different items here, but everything kind of means the same thing. We see that people became much more tense following the onset of COVID. This is my experience, at least, much more worried about the economy, and about a bit more fearful of death, which makes some sense. They didn't really change in whether they thought the values of the country were off track. So we see some threat. People felt it, not on every possible threat, but they felt more threatened by economic situations, a bit more fearful of death, and more tense, right? So this economic threat, potentially some sort of death threat, and just general tenseness. So then how do attitudes change? So just a reminder, everything shifts conservative, or at least tons of stuff shifts conservative. Cultural issues shift conservative, or security issues shift conservative, and health or social welfare issues shift liberal. Okay, I'll remind you of those more as we go. So this is a big figure. This is from the first study. This is, so each dot there is the change estimate and the 95% confidence interval. If it's got a triangle around it, it has covariates. If it's got a circle, it doesn't, although that's not really so important for how you understand the rest of the graph, just so you know. Each of the attitude types has a different color. So this is requiring waiting for abortion. And so that's a cultural issue. So that's got this nice pink color. And then everything is coded so that positive changes are conservative shifts and negative changes are liberal shifts. So we should, and they're ordered by the size of the coefficient. So we should see liberal shifts over on the top left and conservative shifts down here. Here's the big reveal. So the change estimate, sorry, is the y-axis, or sorry, the x-axis there. So a lot of stuff just hovering around this 0 point, so of no change. So just a reminder, so we have two conservative shift hypotheses. We should look for these down in this bottom right-hand corner. And so first of all, we can see that not everything shifts conservative, and actually many things don't shift conservative. The only conservative shifts we get reliably are down here. And these are they're primarily about limiting trade with China. So there does seem to be some like anti-Chinese sentiment going on here. And people did become more approving of Trump after the onset of the pandemic. Not by a lot, but by a bit. And this is considered some other work that's been published that does find a similar kind of incumbent approval type effect that we're also seeing here. At the same time, though, this is it. So if there's broad changes in people becoming more conservative due to threat, it's not showing up here. In fact, most of these things don't move, right? We also look at culturally conservative shift. We also don't really see that. So the one of this red box that's on the bottom right, this is rape as an exception for abortion. And people non-significantly, but moved in a conservative direction on this. So they became less accepting of that as an exception. But it's non-significant. At the same time, this item here is that I'm just kind of highlighting these for convenience, but this one here is 10 commandments in public schools, so religion and public life item. People did not move on that at all, and if anything, maybe moved liberal, but not really. I mean, it's not different. It's clearly consistent with 0. So we don't get much in terms of culturally conservative shift or conservative shifts. It's just things did not change on those. So then we look at issue ownership shift. So did things shift conservative on security issues? Maybe a tiny bit, but they're also not different from 0. So items about the size of the military or deporting undocumented immigrants or building the wall, all these things, they basically didn't move, but if anything, they maybe moved a little bit conservative, but basically didn't move. But also at the same time, there's ones that are more of kind of non-significantly, but moved in a liberal direction. So again, not strong support that there's people are moving in a conservative direction on these issues. And then finally, we're looking at liberal shifts here. These are the top left. We see that people did shift more liberal on government services and subsidizing health insurance. So that's consistent with this hypothesis, but don't like get super thrilled because at the same time, guaranteeing jobs for Americans, that's the top right, that didn't move at all. People didn't move at all at that. Or government insurance for everybody also didn't move. So these kind of more extreme versions of these policies, nothing. Maybe more moderate positions, people moved a little bit more. That's my kind of post hoc and how I think about it. All right, this is the second study. Same kind of figure. It's just easier because there's not 60 of them. Again, same kind of hypotheses. Here are conservative shifts. They move a touch more conservative on their ideological identification, their approval of Trump, and on gun control. The climate change item has a relatively, well, has a shift that's as large as the gun control one, but the standard errors are bigger. Interesting.
For what it's worth,
I think, all right. So
it's still working in the room. It's just, it looks like maybe the screen switched or something.
okay, so for people on Zoom, you should know that they went from seeing the screen or the slide you're seeing to seeing a really nice informative slide about how the meeting has ended, maybe. But we're working on that.
Huh, okay.
It seems like it's an issue with here, wouldn't it?
Chad's off.
Okay.
Given that it is switched to.
Kind of looks like, yeah, you're off.
Well, so I'm still on Zoom, but I'm just, for some reason it's just not showing on here.
All right, so
I mean, I can talk and gesture wildly with my arms. That's all right.
I'm just gonna try and connect you here again. Sorry for all these issues.
Can we just put it on that screen without this being connected to Zoom?
Let's try.
It's like just go through. That was it. Yeah.
It's like it's still.
Let's just.
Can you advance the slide for just a moment, make sure that it's still synced on both? Yep, we're working on both.
Okay.
Nice. Okay.
All right. Okay. Crisis averted, I think. Cool. All right. So the Zoom people, you've had the much more good experience through this particular hiccup. So, it's trade-offs. So there are some conservative shifts, but it's not across most issues, and they're all relatively small here. None of these shifts are on cultural issues. So for example, here's immigration and abortion, which can be considered cultural issues. They are right around 0. We look at security issues. We have just more of them in the study. People did become more conservative on gun control, which would be consistent with this, but they also became more liberal on wanting to fight terrorism, less interested in spending time and money on that. Things like defense spending, crime, immigration didn't shift. When we look at this health and social welfare issues, that's a little bit more consistent. Attitudes about childhood vaccines didn't move around much, but aid to the poor, healthcare, unemployment benefits, economic stimulus all shifted in a liberal direction. So it seems like there is a bit of a liberal shift on these social welfare issues in this particular data. Just to kind of give you a sense a little bit what these things look like over time, these are the same kind of plots that you saw with the threat plots from before. The red shaded area there, those are data that we don't include in the models, and we just have, but I'm plotting them here just to have the full picture. And as you can see, as you kind of go through time, it's relatively flat on many of these. And when COVID hits, well, actually not much happens. But down here on these bigger liberal shifts, you can see that people really kind of dropped off and became much more liberal after the onset of COVID. These are the conservative shifts up here. Although the change estimate is significant, you can see just visually, these are much smaller changes overall. So when we look across all these different hypotheses, we see that there's no clear support for most of them, and really only kind of sometimes-ish support for health and social welfare liberal shifts. I think personally, the social welfare stuff kind of came out most consistently, but overall there was mixed results there too. Okay, so another thing that we wanted to look at here, and I think I still have time to talk about this, is whether or not the theories work better for some people than for others. So basically the idea here is that all the estimates I just showed you are estimates on average. So on average, do people shift in one direction or the other across all these different attitudes? But it might be the case that for some people, they are shifting in a more conservative direction across a lot of them, but there's maybe other people who are shifting more in a liberal direction. And we might find that some of these theories do a good job explaining the patterns of results that they get for some people, just not everybody. So to do that, what we want to do is estimate essentially the effect of the pandemic for each individual person. So estimate the Mark Brandt effect of the pandemic, the Steve Heine effect of the pandemic, and so on. So to do this, we borrow methods from personalized medicine. And what they try to estimate there is what they call predicted individual treatment effects. So there's a few things to unpack about that. So they're predicted effects. So these are not directly observed. We're making some inferences here, but they are aimed to apply to an individual and are the effect of the treatment, or in this case, the effect of the onset of the pandemic. In our panel study, the second study, this is relatively straightforward because we have this dummy variable that's our change indicator. We include that variable as a random slope. We can see that random slope is significant across all the different attitudes that we study. We extract the random slopes for everyone, and this is the estimate of the pandemic for each person. I know this is a really quick thing, so depending on your knowledge of multi-level models, this is either went way over your head and I'm sorry, or you're like, this isn't the whole story and I'm sorry for that as well. But the idea is that because we have data from the same people over time, it's a little bit easier to make these estimates. Study one is much more complicated because it's repeated cross sections. We do not have the same people. We don't have the same people before and after. So we have to make guesses, essentially, what they're doing before and after. And this is essentially, so if we assume that the onset of the pandemic was close to random, then we can treat this as a missing data problem. For all the people that we had the data for before the onset of the pandemic, we just don't have it for them afterwards. And this is just like a missing data problem. There's lots of methods out there for estimating missing data. And so we can then borrow those methods to estimate what they would be like after the pandemic. And we can do the same thing for people who we have the data for after the onset of the pandemic. So essentially, like pre-COVID, we have record player lady and we have basketball player down there, and we have different data. And we're basically kind of saying, well, what would record player lady be like if we had data from her post-COVID? What would our basketball player look like if we had data from them pre-COVID? That's kind of what we're trying to figure out. So what we do is we have our sample, we have our pre-COVID part of our sample, we have our post-COVID part of our sample, all different people. And for our pre-COVID part of the sample, what we do is we estimate people's pre-COVID responses to all the different attitudes. And we build a model to build a model, we are using essentially the multi-level model we had before, but just chopping off all the data post-COVID. And then we add in this big random effect that is a bunch of demographic indicators and their interactions between each other. And so then we can get the estimate of people's responses pre-COVID for all these different demographics and combination of demographic indicators. So we're basically using this demographic information to impute to estimate these models. Because then what we'll do is we then use those models to impute, based on this combination of demographic information, the estimated responses for everybody for the pre-COVID. So this is their pre-COVID estimated. And then we do the same thing for the post-COVID data. We build these models, we estimate people's responses, and then we have their estimated responses post-COVID. And the predicted individual treatment effect is just the difference between these two. Now, so the assumptions used here is that first, there's a few assumptions it's useful to just be clear about. So one is that we're assuming that the onset of COVID is essentially random, and so that we can treat these as missing data completely at random, which maybe, but that's always a tricky assumption. Another assumption is that we can use these demographics to reliably kind of predict what the people's responses are going to be. I think it's reasonable to make this assumption, but it is an assumption. And so in this kind of estimate here is based on a variety of kind of assumptions about our data and our data generating process, because in most of the statistics, if you can't do it, if what you don't buy with your design, you're buying with assumptions. So in our second study with panel data, we're buying more with our design, whereas here we're buying more with assumptions. And then we're going to look at how these different things are distributed and see what our estimated effects are. I can talk more about that process if you want. I've not nailed the level of information to give on those slides. So on this figure, I'm just going to first show you the distribution of people's responses their estimated individual treatment effect. So on the x-axis is the estimated effect. So it's the estimated change, but for each person this time. These are each of the little things I'm going to show you are essentially like kind of like compressed mini histograms, because this many histograms looks terrible is what I learned. And the skinny line is the complete range from everybody in the sample. The slightly thicker line is 95% of the sample, and the thickest line is 60% of the sample. And then that little dot in the middle is the estimate from the prior slide. So that's the average effect of everybody. So we can see for unemployment benefits, for example, although it's an estimated liberal shift, there are people who show a conservative shift and some people who show a much larger liberal shift. And when we look across all of these, there's a fair degree of variation across all of them. Some more variation than others. So for example, if you look at, nope, I don't. So if you look at ideological identification, for example, on this study 2, there's the range is kind of big, but like most people are right around, not changing at all. And that makes some sense. Ideological identification is super, super stable. It doesn't change very much. So we wouldn't expect gigantic changes here. But we do get a range of changes across all of these different measures. Not everybody is showing the same effect here. So then what we do is we take all of these and we're like, okay, how many people show evidence for a conservative shift, a cultural conservative shift, and so on. And we basically are just kind of counting up how many people show this. So right here, this conservative shift here is the percentage of people in the sample who shift in a conservative direction across all of the different attitudes, which is functionally no one. We look at people who shifted in a conservative direction across all the cultural issues, mostly no one, although maybe up to 3% of the sample in study 2. And then when we look at these this 3 that make this issue ownership version, most people are not moving in a consistently conservative direction on security issues across both samples. But you do get between 16 and 35% of people shifting in a liberal direction on health issues, and about 60% of people moving in a liberal direction on social welfare issues. But of course, that means that there's 40% of people roughly who are doing something else, right? So the theory is that social welfare liberal shift, they're getting it mostly right for about 60% of the people, but they're getting it varying levels of wrong for the 60%. Interestingly enough, though, when you look at this combined, so do people show a conservative shift on security issues while showing a liberal shift on health and social welfare policies? That doesn't happen. That's not a thing. So we see that what the conservative shift, nearly no one supports it. People don't really support the culturally conservative shift, maybe 3% in one study. Issue ownership, not in combination, but on average, but maybe for some of the individuals a bit. So we see that some attitudes change on average, but the changes are not, at least I don't think, convincingly predicted by existing threat theories. And I, to be honest, was a little surprised by this. These threats are usually small on average, and given just the huge impact that the pandemic had on many people's lives, I gotta say I'm a little surprised by how small many of these effects were. And we find that they vary a lot across participants. And I want to say a little bit more about this, because there's not just one threat effect. It seems like there's there's multiple threat effects, and it depends on the attitudes. So they show, some are conservative moving, some are liberal moving, and it depends on the participant. It varies a lot across these participants. So I think in general, this heterogeneity in these threats are potentially the norm, and I think to me are becoming more the thing that needs to be explained. I don't think we have a good handle on this. So just to give you another example on why I think this is from another paper of mine published a couple of years ago. This is data from a bunch of different countries, and we have people's kind of perceptions of threats across 6 different threats, and then that'll be on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is people's ideology, whether they're left-wing or right-wing. And Kristen saw me present this before, and she was like, maybe objective threats are different, and that is part of the reason why the COVID study exists. But so in this study, we have people basically how worried they are about war and terrorism. So it's what we call a violence threat. And on average, across all the countries, this is a positive effect. So people who are more worried about war and violence are more right-leaning compared to people who are less worried. But each of those lines is a different country. And those lines are all over the place. And actually about a third of countries, the estimate is in the opposite direction. The ones that are highlighted with the dashed lines, those are just the most extreme positive, negative, and then the US, because most of these studies are in the US, so it's a useful comparison. When we look at people's kind of worries about what we call neighborhood threats, so this is like crime, but within the neighborhood. Here, on average, this is people who are worried about crime in their neighborhood tend to be more left-leaning. But again, this is about 70% show the opposite effect. So, oh, sorry, 30% show the opposite effect. So there's a lot of heterogeneity here. And actually, we look across all of the different threats that we have in the study, there's just a tons of heterogeneity across all of them. There's just this as the norm. So whether the threat matters, the attitude seems to matter, and the country you're in seems to matter. So the data I presented to you today is primarily from the United States. And so those average effects from the US, I'm actually not super convinced those would replicate in other countries. They might. But I'm not putting much money there. The thing I would put money on is that this high degree of variability across attitudes and across people. I think that is what's replicable. And if that's the case, then it suggests that we need to figure out where is all this variability coming from? Why are we seeing it? So to start to work through this, me and Bert Bacher, recently we published this really short paper. It's like a long email, so it's really too short. But one of the things that part of what we think is that threat and threat perceptions might lead to people's political preferences, in part because when people feel threats, we know from other work that they search for threat-related information. Depending on what information you get is going to likely swing you in different directions. People get different information. If you, depending on your news source, the information that's available in your country, what kind of things happen to come up in your Google search algorithm compared to mine, might all be the kind of things that introduce some of this variability. The other thing that is that, and this kind of goes back to the original work in these theories, is that people think that threat causes people's political preferences because people see them as addressing the threat. But people will see different issues and political attitudes as addressing threats in different ways. For me, it might be one set of attitude positions, but for some of you, it might be a different set of attitude positions. And this variability in how we see kind of threats and political attitudes as going together or not going together might also be where some of this variation is. There's probably other sources too, but these are the ones that we had thought about and are in this and have a nice figure for. So I think this variability is kind of the story in the end. There's not a lot of big on average effects, but there is a lot of variability, and trying to get a handle on when that variability is and being able to predict it and understand it, I think is really the next direction for this kind of general line of research to go. So thanks.
Right, we have time for questions. Here's the mic. Jess, question. Yes.
Okay, new. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
One thing I thought about, and I love the fact that data are like not straightforward, because that's, we don't usually see that, and it's nice to see that sometimes we don't support our predictions. That's cool too. So one thing that occurred to me is that maybe COVID is actually just really unique and different than a typical pathogen threat. And so like the example that came to my mind was, I remember when during the time of like the fear and everything, beginning of 2020, I'm very pro-immigration. I'm an immigrant here in Canada, but I was super happy when, they closed the border to the US. And in BC, we actually had all these regulations and rules. People were awesome about following them. So we had like one of the lowest COVID rates early on of any province, maybe the lowest. And like Toronto and Montreal were terrible. And I remember thinking, like, we should close the provincial border, and so like that wasn't an you can see it as anti-immigration, it would be measured as anti-immigration, but it came from the increased social health stuff, right? That I wanted governments taking care of health, and I knew it was happening in BC and not elsewhere. And so I just wonder whether it's such a unique thing, we can't actually draw large kind of, conclusions, because that was such a unique situation where, things like that really fed into each other, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So first, can the online people hear the question? They can? Okay, great. So I'm not gonna repeat all your unique examples. So I think, so the idea that, so I think there's a couple of things that are interesting about the pandemic in this regard. So one is that I think prior to the pandemic, if you asked me what a pandemic was, I'd be like, oh, it's like this health threat thing. And actually the pandemic is a bunch of stuff, right? It's not just one thing. It is this virus, of course, but it is also government's responses to that virus, not only your own government, but also the governments in other places. So apparently those crazy people in Toronto and Montreal, like, what do they have? And it's a mix of those reactions. And so when I talk about the onset of the pandemic, at least in this work, I think we are capturing all of that, and we're not able to pin down one thing. Now, so then it kind of raises this question. It's like, okay, so if this big societal event is this unique thing, and there's all these other things going on, so maybe we just can't use our theories to understand it. I just find that really depressing, I guess. And so like if we have our theories that work well in like these really tightly controlled situations, but then the real thing that looks a lot like what we've been talking about doesn't fit, I find that actually like, that means that there's important variables in our studies that we're missing, right? And so maybe when we're running these threat studies, we need to run like, I don't know, threat plus studies. So here's a threat and here's how your government reacted to it, or here's a threat and then here's some information, and then see what kind of combinations moves people around. Because I think otherwise, if we can't generalize to something like this, I just find it frustrating.
Like, sorry, because I wonder, like, in thinking about pathogen stuff, and I've seen studies like, I know Mark, he's recovering from stuff, so he's not here, but he has this cool paper on pathogen threat and how it led to, use conservatism and stuff. But I think this is the first time, at least in North America, where we've had a pathogen threat that actually led to this major behavioral change that was mandated in a lot of places by governments with mask wearing. And maybe that's something that social psychologists didn't take into account.
Yeah.
Imagine. So maybe now we can do better.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think so. I kind of, it kind of depends on what mood I'm in when you get me. So like this answer will change if you see this talk in a few months or whatever. But like, I think one way to think about this is like, sure, these predictions didn't pan out, but I think that doesn't mean like we give up, right? I think we kind of then say, well, what are the things that maybe we missed, and maybe the things that are really important for driving some of this attitude change or attitude stability or whatever it might be. And we can kind of look at this kind of observational study with all these different attitudes and be like, okay, well, what are we missing about this event? And like that we're not seeing this pattern of results kind of in our studies. And I think it's just kind of a iterative process, right? We make these predictions and then like, crap. And then we go from there. And I think that's the way to think about it. At least that's today how I think about it.
Thanks, Mark. That was a super interesting talk. And I don't want to get depressed like you are about whether articles in the real world. So I was actually just curious because I think that there's another potential theoretical prediction you could have looked at. And I think you could look at it in your data. I'm curious if you thought about it at all, which is just that threats make people more extreme, like just double down on what they originally thought. And I think you would have to do, I mean, it's sort of connected to the individual differences that you were just talking about, but I'm curious if you thought about looking at anything like that and whether you saw any evidence for it.
Yeah, so there is a possibility of this. I haven't looked at this in depth, to be fair, but and part of this is like I'm having some challenge of figuring out what is the optimal amount of information to put into a paper about this, but that's a different thing. But at one point we were kind of said, okay, well, maybe this is moderated by ideology in some way. That might be, so especially in the second study where we have all of this data from before COVID ever happens, it's inferentially not a problem to include ideology as a moderator here because you can include all their pre-pandemic ideology stuff. And what I remember from that is that actually on like those social welfare variables that changed a lot in the second study, for conservatives, they changed the most. Now, I think some of this, though, is that liberals, they also moved more social welfare, but they were also kind of more in favor of these things to begin with. So it wasn't totally obvious to me that this is a more extremity effect, but I have not looked into this in depth, and maybe those are exceptions. And so I don't want to say that that's the final word on it.
Thank you. I thought that was a really terrific talk, and I also really appreciate how you did present all those wrinkles and the data. I think we don't do that enough, and I appreciate you doing it. I was really wondering if there's more that's happening here that we could see if we extended that time window. And I totally agree with your argument for not necessarily looking further than George Floyd, because there is that huge sociocultural disruption that probably overrides some of these effects. But and this is mostly drawing from, I mean, since Jess was drawing from anecdotes and personal experience. I was in the UK when COVID hit, and I felt up until May, which is what your data is covering in the US, didn't really feel like a threat. It really felt like a threat when suddenly it seemed like this would never stop. So people were actually prepared to sit this one out for a few weeks. It was even fun at first. Most of my friends were just Netflixing all the time, and they were happy they didn't have to go to work. And so I wonder if those big shifts really occur a little later when people are like, oh shit, this is actually here to stay. And also, I guess, another way to think about this may be to zoom in on different regions, where in the US, there was this time where New York was this epicenter. Friends that I had in New York were extremely worried.
Yeah.
Other people I knew that were in other parts of the country were like, it's not here. I don't know anybody who has it. You know, this is all overrated. So I'm not sure to what extent you could get at this with the data that you have, but I do think it might actually support these theories more than what we're seeing right here. And if it doesn't, I think the other interesting, sorry, this is a long comment, I'll stop in a second. I think the other interesting thing there could be to indicate whether there is something like a set point thing going on, where the change that we do see bounce back after some time, which would also be interesting. So this is really just to say, to the extent you have more data, even if it may be confounded with George Floyd, I think would be cool to look at it.
Yeah, so there is, I mean, there's more data that are out there. So I'm pretty open to, so I think like personal, like if, I don't really, I don't have a personal stake in whether these theories play out. And so if it's the case that they kind of come into force over time, I think that would be potentially a really interesting finding. It would also kind of suggest, like, to kind of go back to the lab experiments that I keep mentioning, but like, it'd be interesting to think about that even in those terms, right? So if we don't have immediate effects, but you have effects after months, and that also suggests some things about how we would want to think about our lab experiments and set up how we could observe those kind of things as well. I mean, I think there's some really interesting implications there. Yeah, but I mean, there's very short answers. I have not done that, but I think those are interesting ideas. I think the set point thing is almost certainly happening, but I have well, I haven't looked at that, but I mean, just because I've seen American politics since, I'd be shocked if that wasn't happening. But getting a handle on that would be interesting. I think another variation on this that would be interesting is, so for some people, there's probably a set point, and they're like, I think particularly the more conservative people in our sample, they're probably like, yep, unemployment is support. But then like after a couple of months, it's like, all right, knock it off, go back to work sort of thing, right? But if there are also people though who didn't do that, they became more supportive of unemployment and healthcare, and then they actually stayed. And they were like, no, this was a good thing in the pandemic. It's a good thing now. And getting a handle on who those people are and the trajectories of change, super interesting. There is more data that I have that's available, but just haven't looked at those questions. But yeah, super interesting.
I was originally going to say like exactly what Fritz said, but because I still want to talk, I'm going to just expand on it a little bit.
That's right.
Which is to sort of say that my sense, I totally get the George Floyd thing, and obviously that changed a lot of people's attitudes about a lot of things. But it really feels like COVID got political after that period, and maybe partly because of George Floyd and that situation. But at the time, in the first few months, it was everybody with hearts on their windows, and we're all in this together. And you can imagine this strong liberal shift without a corresponding conservative shift, because even the conservatives were like, yeah, we are all in this together, I guess, or whatever, right? But then it got really political. And I think about how your data might allow you to look at regional differences in this, in terms of where it was an immediate threat versus less so. If you could, potentially get Canadian data, like Canada got really conservative way later than the US did, right? We were all in it together for longer, but then eventually we had the freedom riders and whatever happening like 18 months later or whatever it was. Yeah, so anyway, just thinking about those shifts and why, you might just be in this acute state where the theories can't be right in some sense because it was so acute. Maybe this is also what Jess was saying.
Yeah, I guess I don't, I think the dynamics over time are interesting. How it responds to politicization, I think, is important. And it certainly did. The thing that I find, I guess, challenging is that then I'm not really sure. So I think already with the data we have, when I'm saying the onset of the pandemic, I think that already encapsulates a bunch of stuff, including the virus, but also these other things. And I think as you extend it, you kind of lose a lot of this inferential. Well, I don't even think I have lots of inferential precision in terms of the construct that's being changed here, but I think you lose a lot of that. And maybe that's okay, I think, to see how some of these things shift, but I think being able to attribute it to different things becomes much harder. The other thing is I think, and maybe it could be just different readings of these theories, but I think a lot of the kind of, we need some time for this stuff to kick in, or these other aspects need to kick in. I don't think the theories make any room for that. Especially so if you look at the kind of conceptually similar studies, but they use terrorist events, they're like, the terrorist event happened, okay, where's the change? And it's a one to the next. And there's not well, let's see how this plays out kind of aspect to it. And so I think it could definitely be the case that there's other kind of missing ingredients of this that we're not getting, but I think there are also missing ingredients in the theoretical perspectives, which is, yeah, interesting. I mean, kind of what I said to Jess before is some of this is then, okay, this kind of gives us some insight into maybe what we need to think about including as we go forward. But at least in terms of the theories as they exist now, or at least as I understand them, I don't think they're making those predictions. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Sorry. So I happened to be on the association committee on Monday where they were looking at COVID and responses, and it's like you said, everyone's doing it. But it's still really cool. And what this guy did was he actually looked at people in Washington, the state, which is out here, and then Maine, similarly north, but there was no COVID threat 2 different times in March of 2020. Yeah. So and he did that purposely to be like high threat, low threat, there should be a difference. And interestingly, he found no difference in terms of how much perceived threat they had. And of course, there's a lot of potential reasons that one might be, that occurred to me was there's the threat of I'm going to get this because someone in Washington has it. And then there's the threat of the world is changing, which was equal, I think.
Right.
So just to support.
Yeah, I think I kind of I'm sympathetic to this idea of regional differences because I mean, so I was in the Netherlands at the time. The Netherlands was on and the US were on the same schedule but shifted by 2 weeks. And so then I was talking to my parents and being look, this is what's coming down the pike for you, just so you know. And it's get it together, folks. And which was scary but weird. But what I found is that the levels of threat were different across the countries, but it kind of felt like everybody felt it in a similar way. But this is my own hunch based, so.
Well, thanks so much. Awesome talk. The individual variability is so fascinating to me, and I do personality work. So when I see that, I'm like, okay, what individual differences explain this? And then I find it difficult that my train of thought kind of stops there. So I'm curious, from your perspective, kind of how do we look at all that individual variability and try to get clues about what particular characteristics, demographics, whatever it might be, are causing some people to shift left and some people to shift right, or some issues, not much variability, which other ones have huge ones.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I don't think there's going to be one right answer here. I think there's probably lots of things going on, in part because the issues are really varied. And so some of it is going to just be different because for different issues, because the things at stake are different. I think some of it is probably some of these demographics, but I don't know. I don't have a good sense of like what to predict, why one would matter. We can look more, I mean, I could look more carefully at all these models and be like, okay, so this combination of demographics is producing one shift. Haven't done that in part because there's 80 of them and it's annoying. So it's not all one thing, I think, but some of it is going to be the stuff we use to predict the missing data in some of these models. Some of it is, I think, is going to be people's prior attitudes. It's going to shift or kind of condition a little bit on what happens. I mean, so what I described to Kristen before, like at least when we were exploring this at one point, we're like, okay, well, maybe ideology is a moderator, and things seem to move more for offer on some of those attitudes for conservatives and liberals. So maybe it's some, depending on where your prior position is. But I think in some of these cases, it's going to be a little bit more like where are people getting their information from? Who are the people around them who are reinforcing their views and their experiences? And I think those are things, some of these things you maybe can approximate with survey questions about where they're getting their news or something like that. But others, I don't think we have good data on. And I think kind of figuring out what are those important variables is clearly like an important step here. I don't have like a firm handle on what all those things would be either. Like I kind of said at the end, I think some of it is going to be how people construe it. So like, does this connect to this? Like, is this a good response to COVID sort of thing? And I think some of it is going to be based on like how are other people in your environment telling you to put these things together? We know that people learn how political attitudes go together in general, in part by looking to elites, looking to the news media, and they see, oh, okay, abortion and low taxes, those go together in this way, two issues that shouldn't be associated, right? But they look to political elites and they see how to put them together. I think that's kind of what's happening with some of these threats. They look to elites or their favorite person on TV, and they're like, oh, COVID's happening, here's how you should react. And that's also feeding into this. And but I think it's a complicated story. I don't think there's one answer here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I know that the effect size was really small, but you had highlighted like early on that some of like the anti-China conservative shift had happened.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that like in the face of threat, people search for threat-related information. So I'm just wondering what role, if any, you think like conspiratorial thinking might play in people's search for threat-related information, and whether that might have like driven that small like anti-China effect, like if they think that maybe they manufactured the virus.
Yeah, so I don't know whether it's the conspiratorial thinking or what exactly is driving the kind of it's like anti-trade with China in particular. I think some of it is at that time. So Trump was always kind of looking for anti-China excuses. This was throughout much of his administration, but the pandemic was helpful for his cause of finding things to complain about. But there's a lot of talk about like putting different kinds of controls on China in terms of trade and stuff around the same time. And so I think some of it is just people following the lead of what was happening on these kind of press conferences that were happening around the same time. I'm not sure. I don't exactly remember when some of these conspiracy theories exactly started to pop up. And if those had yet popped up in force or not, but it's definitely a possibility. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, like I was kind of wondering, like maybe some of the efforts to like contain China or to harm their economy might be to kind of like if you see them as the threat to reduce it.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I guess like what's missing, like we just don't have the variables, but is to get a sense on, is this specific about like these trade policies with China, or is this part of a broader kind of anti-China sentiment, or trying to punish China or whatever the reasoning might be? But we just don't have the things to really know. Yeah, it makes sense.
I have a question here.
one sort of take-home message I've got from this is just how hard it is to move from the lab into the real world. And whether COVID, I mean, it was this many-headed beast, and how, especially in that first window of what you're studying there, if it really was the same threat to I mean, depending on what news you're watching, you know, you might be hearing that this is all exaggerated, this is all made up, this is really the government's for manufacturing a crisis. And that's what a lot of people were getting that view, or other people were, you know, getting the view that, you know, this, their loved ones are in threat. So I'm just wondering, like, as I'm hoping that future, hoping for future threats, no, for the good of research, that future threats might have more consensus on what exactly the threat is and means, if we might get more optimistic support for our theories in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely possible. I think it's I think it's hard to say exactly, but I think that's possible. I mean, you know, maybe this already exists, but I wonder if there's like something, like if there's a field of study or people who are like try to figure out what are the characteristics of real life events that make them most easily translatable between lab and the field. I'm sure people have thought about this, and I'm just naive about it, but I think trying to figure out what those variables are, I think would be useful, because it could be the case that there might be some events that do happen that are much more kind of just closely aligned with how we happen to do our studies, and then for those, we would see a closer alignment between kind of the field and the real world event and the lab. I guess the trick is to know how to what that is before we do it, and I think that'll come maybe with time, but I don't know.
Thanks.
Hey, Mark, very cool stuff. Thanks for coming here to the talk. Yeah, so I was thinking about, like, a lot of these questions seem to be circling around individual differences, and it seems to me like some of the theories predict like perceptions or kind of construals as an individual difference that matters. I know Mark's work looks at like perceived packaging threats.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about, like, you have some data on perceived threats, right? Like at the beginning, like the perceived death threat. So do any of those moderate their effects, or do they moderate differently for different types of threats?
Yeah, so it's challenging to do them as a moderator, because everything is the thing that you would want moderator as happens after the onset of COVID. And so that's tricky. One thing that we can do is you can take the estimated effects for each participant, and you can do that for the threats. So there, for example, there's a subset of the sample who became less tense at the start of COVID. So maybe some of your friends were those people. It's a minority, but they exist. So that's one. So you can take those individual differences, and you can see how those co-vary with some of these changes on the attitudes. We've done this. I wonder if I have extra slides with them. I might not. Nope, I don't. All right, sorry. They exist. If you ask me, well, at a different time, they're on the computer. But what you find is that when the economic threat, people who became more threatened economically, they also became more liberal on those social welfare issues. Not as strong, but also for feeling, I think, more tense, and I think potentially the death threat, but I forgot exactly. But then there's a smattering of others where people, they changed, you know, if they felt more threatened, they also then maybe became more conservative on some of these other issues. Those are less prevalent and less consistent, but there's a smattering of those as well. So that's kind of one way we kind of looked at this, was maybe the people who have a bigger, you know, economic threat, they also have a bigger change in this other domain. So that's one thing that's potentially like consistent with this idea that people are construing it and experiencing more threat, they should then move more in these other directions. That is, yeah, if this was a messy version of the results, this actually just adds to the mess a little bit, but it's kind of one way that we're trying to think about how to handle that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
My comment was kind of similar to Gordon's, but I think like just to kind of maybe put it in the context of the questions that you're trying to answer. I think the question, like one interpretation of this is that everybody responded differently to a threat, and our theories are telling us nothing about how people respond to threat. The other interpretation is like this threat wasn't experienced as a threat to the same degree by all people,
Right.
and it's the degree to which you've experienced
Yep.
whatever threat that causes these reactions. So I'd be super excited. We can chat more about this in a meeting to hear more about those individual
Yeah,
differences.
yeah, I think that's like once I kind of went down this road of kind of computing these individual differences, it opens a different world of things that you can also compute. Because the other thing that you can do with them is you can see which attitudes change in tandem. And I think that's also kind of an interesting thing. I don't have those results quite at the top of my head, but I know that we can do that. And I remember finding them interesting. So like, but it just kind of opens up your world of things that can be done with them. Yeah, I think there's some
Yeah.
interesting things.
Because even the way that you group the attitudes, like that might not correspond to the groupings that people have in their own
Yep.
ideological maps.
Exactly. Yep.
Super interesting.
Any more last questions here? Darko, is there any on? Okay, then, thank you very much, Mark.
Right.
It was great for our first. And Mark will still be around for the rest of the day.